So everybody's done some bad things in their life, but not many of us are convicted war criminals. The Last Emperor is about one such person who was a war criminal and how he had to deal with it. I watched an old interview with John Lone where he weighed in on this topic, and he defended Puyi, saying that he did not have a choice. Basically, his choice was either to go with the Japanese plans for him in Manchukuo, or he would have been assassinated by somebody in Chinese politics. He still held too much importance at that time, and somebody somewhere in politics would have taken him out. So he went with the Japanese. As we've spoken about before, this is one of the critical moments in the movie, and it ends horribly. It ends with Puyi being a participant in the Japanese occupation of China and all the associated war crimes that went with it. The movie, I feel, for sure does not want us to see him as a willing or active participant in the atrocities that the Japanese regime caused to happen in China during that time. When he's seen as the emperor of Manchukuo, from the start, it's seen that Puyi is really delusional to think from the beginning that he's the real emperor of Manchukuo, that he has any real political power. His coronation is probably one of the few comedic parts of the movie. It's really just seen as a joke. There's camels there. It looks very second rate. And then gradually his tenure as the emperor is just one event after another where the Japanese are just more and more taking power. It's becoming more and more obvious. They're pushing him aside. They're just even worse than the eunuchs in some way, which more, it just seemed that they just wanted to have the freedom to loot the Forbidden City. Now the Japanese officials are just bullying Puyi into submission. Okay, so he is a part of the regime, and he is the emperor once again. And really, the second half of the movie is him falling into a similar situation that he fell into in the first half of his life. And it's in some ways his own personal failure. It's his failure to in politics to excel. Although he couldn't leverage his position as the emperor to any real political power. So in some ways, the second half of the movie deals with this struggle inside of him to reconcile his own inability to use the power that he had for any real meaningful success in politics. Because just like in the first half of the movie, he has absolute power on paper, but he does not make the necessary connections in politics. He doesn't build alliances. He doesn't use the bully pulpit. Any of these things which are associated with political power, he does not utilize for himself. In the first half of the movie, he had Johnston to help him. For really, it was the compassion of Johnston and maybe a little bit of Johnston's somewhat murky connections to the British government. But like we said in the last podcast, I think the movie does try to show Johnston as having genuine compassion for the young Puyi. Johnston takes him on and tries to help him, tries to make him the best that he can be. At least that's what it looks like. I mean, it's only a 3-hour movie, but he has Johnston and a couple of others, the Empress and I believe one of the advisors that he hires, Chen Xiaoshu, I believe was his name. But the main person is Johnston, but he doesn't have anybody like this in the second half of the movie. It's almost like he naively believed that the Emperor of Japan, being of a similar age and obviously also being born into the Emperor's role, that he thought that they were friends and that was enough to trust him. So that's where what he's missing. He doesn't really have anybody like that. The Empress tries to she makes her stance known that she is not in favor of what the program that the Japanese have for Puyi. But he doesn't. So she can be seen in that way, but he doesn't listen to her. And maybe he didn't listen to Johnston either when Johnston advised him to take another route. So he's very alone at this point. The second half of the movie in Manchukuo is, again, it's very lonely. We're seeing an isolated man. We're seeing somebody being cut off and cast away, basically. And I think it's a real interesting point where he ends up in prison for being a war criminal. And in some ways he was. I think the movie does a good job. It doesn't completely excuse him from being a participant in what happened in Manchuria, but he has to learn to see himself for what he was. And this is now the role of the governor in the prison, who takes on a somewhat mentor or role, or a role as a teacher for helping him. So there's an important role of these teachers and mentors who want to help him. Because I don't see any kind of selfish motive for the governor in the prison. There's scenes where he buys Twilight in the Forbidden City, Johnston's book. And in his spare time, he's reading it. He's interested in Puyi. He's interested in the story. When the other prison guard is angrily accusing Puyi of participation in the war crimes, the governor is sitting back in the back of the room and he's observing. He's not saying that much. The war crimes were still probably fresh in the minds of many Chinese people at this time, and I can see where many of them would feel very angry and possibly want revenge for all these horrible things that happened at that time. And Puyi, especially as a Manchurian and a Chinese person, that he was a collaborator with the occupiers during this terrible time. So there's that aspect of it going on. But what the governor helps him with is to see his own role, not to exaggerate his own role, because Puyi is suicidal in the prison. That's how the movie opens, is with him in prison and deciding to kill himself. And he's generally very depressed when he's in prison. We watch him seeing a newsreel of what the Japanese did in World War II. And then he's put in a cell with other collaborators from the Manchurian regime. So he's being put face to face with what he did, with who he has been in the last 10, 15 years of his life, and everything that happened. And what he does is he takes on a position that he was the one responsible for it. That because he was the emperor at that time, that he was responsible for everything that he, as he puts it. And the governor, as part of helping him rehabilitate himself, he calls on him to see what he did. He calls on him to only be responsible for what he did. He probably, according to the movie, did not know about what was happening in Harbin. He wasn't the person initiating it, and he probably wasn't aware of many things because he was not a real emperor. So, as we mentioned in other episodes, this leads to his rehabilitation as a person. It's coming to terms with who he really was. That part of his own narcissism was seeing himself as something he was not, was seeing himself as an emperor, that he should have been the emperor, that he was entitled to it, and seeing himself more as a man, not a living God. And then once he is aware of this and he doesn't see himself in prison as somebody who's still the emperor, then he can rehabilitate himself. So there's some scenes where the governor purposely unties Puyi's shoes and tells him that he has to tie them. And this is something he's never done in his life. And part of the reason he's doing that is to tell him, you're not actually a living God who is owed the right for somebody to tie your own shoes. You're just a person. And let's not say that this excuses Puyi from everything. He still has to serve out his prison term because he was a collaborator. He was a participant. But he serves out his term, but he comes to terms with what he did, who he was, and the movie at least shows him to be rehabilitated at the end. And the second half of the movie is much grayer. You don't get this full splendor of the imperial years, but it's also great in its own way. It's almost like the second episode, especially if you watch the 4-hour series. So I don't know if I'll do a separate episode on what I think of the governor, maybe, but I think he played an important role in this half, and I wanted to give that character some time, and also to discuss this issue of the war crimes. Some of you may feel differently. This was an important part of the world after World War II. So, thanks for listening again, and we'll have some more episodes. Take care.